Thanks, Donna. My name again is Charles Pattison. I'm president of 1,000 Friends of Florida. We've been around since 1986. We were the second group of its kind in the country. A couple of our original board members were very impressed with what Oregon was doing and went out there to visit a group called 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And we were modeled after those, after that group, and we've been around ever since. Our basic idea is that the state can grow and prosper and protect the environment if it does so using a good comprehensive planning process like you have in Martin County. Unfortunately, a lot of Florida doesn't have that, but that's why we're working in the legislature to try to stem the tide of some bad ideas. There seem to be more of those than good ideas. Excuse me, I'm a registered lobbyist. I work during the session, which is happening now, run through the end of April. And we usually work with the different conservation organizations. There are a lot more of them than there are of us, and we regularly meet during this time of the year, usually once a week, to check on different bills that are in process, and that's what I'm going to run through for you here. I think we'll have time for some questions after that. Okay, and all of these bills, I've sent this to Donna, so you can get a copy from her, most of these. Just some housekeeping stuff. Most of you probably know this, but if you see an HB in front of a bill, that means it's a House bill. If it's got an SB, it's a Senate bill. The Senate bills are always even numbered, and the House bills have the odd numbers. So I'm going to run through a few of these and let you know what's going on. The first one is House Bill 89, Pafford. It's a growth management bill that would reestablish an urban infill grant program, which would be good. Nothing wrong with that. The only problem is there's no money. In fact, the program was terminated last year because no money had been put in it for the last 5 or 6 years. So we'll see if this can happen, but it's not clear. House Bill 319 is one that we're working on behind the scenes to try to limit some of the damage. This is a bill that developers didn't think they got enough last session, so they're back. This would change or limit how local governments can do some of their mobility planning. There's an option to transportation concurrency that some communities have used. This bill and that process, we think, gives communities some additional flexibility that they might not have with concurrency. Part of this has to do with proportionate share changes. They're not really changing it as much as they are saying, once again, how developers are to be credited for things like impact fees that they've already paid for. But they're trying to bring some of the more restrictive transportation concurrency concepts into the mobility side of planning, and we're working to try to prevent that from happening. House Bill 537, Moriartis. This is an interesting case. You all remember the Amendment 4 fights, and there was a ban that, as part of the growth management legislation last year, that said you cannot now have a referendum on development orders or plan amendments. There was some, actually last year was where some 3 or 4 communities that did have those express provisions were grandfathered. The case came up in Boca Raton where some innovative citizens found a piece of their town charter that allowed ordinances to be challenged by referendum. And the city's position was that that was never intended to cover development orders or plan amendments. That case is now in the 4th District Court of Appeal. Don't know what the outcome might be, but this bill would actually say once and for all that you can't do a referendum on development orders, regardless of what's in your town or county charter, unless it was in effect. I think the date's June 1, 2011. that bears watching. There is a Senate companion for it. Senate Bill 972 is roughly the equivalent of the House Bill 319 that I talked about. Again, we were meeting with some of the developers last week to try to hone down what they're trying to do. I think we're going to get some changes that are positive, but we may not be able to stop the whole bill. This House Bill 321 is another effort by development interests to prohibit for a 3-year period all impact fees. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the one on the bottom. This would keep local governments from collecting impact fees or imposing any kind of concurrency for a 3-year period. I think what the legislature doesn't seem to get is that local governments do have to have funding to cover the impacts from development. And each year we see more and more restrictions on what local governments may or may not do. Senate Bill 786, this is hard to understand what this is meant to do, but I call it an expedited process. We went through a period of change the year before last that limited what state government, at that time DCA, could do as far as reviewing certain plan amendments. And this would reactivate a pilot program that had been in place excuse me, previously, lets the local government have one hearing, adopt it, and move forward unless there's a challenge. It is limited to Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, Hialeah, Pinellas, and Broward counties, but still has some room for concern. And then this one, I hope the lawyers are going to watch this carefully. House Bill 673, Senate Bill 772. It puts into statute some U.S. Supreme Court language that or sort of like the U.S. Supreme Court language dealing with impact fees and rational nexus tests. The concern I've had expressed to me by some legal people is that by putting this term in statute, we're opening it up for the legislature, not the courts, to determine what may or may not be appropriate. We talk about some sort of related bills. This first one is one you probably heard about, Senate Bill 584, House Bill 901. This is just a bad idea that's out there that says no city, no county, no state agency can buy any additional conservation land unless it sells an equal amount. The dual problem here is that not only is this an influential senator, he happens to sit on the Senate Appropriations Committee that would deal with any land acquisition programs. The conservation groups are being, well, they're alarmed, but trying to be rather diplomatic in criticizing this. I think at this point we believe it won't actually happen, but can't be too sure of that. Another kind of problematic land bill is House Bill 33, Senate Bill 466. It's kind of strange. It says if you're a landowner that abuts state-owned property, you can go to the governor and cabinet and propose that some of the state land be transferred to you in exchange for you putting a conservation easement of sorts on your property. We're not sure what the overall intent is. Interestingly, one of the more friendly senators in the legislature, Allman, is the Senate sponsor, so we're hopeful that his sponsorship will mean nothing too odd will happen with the bill, but it's one of concern. Everybody, of course, wants to know what's going on with water issues. Senate Bill 948 is one that all the conservation groups are concerned about. It would basically create a water planning unit within the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And basically, it's supposed to emphasize the role that agriculture has in these consumptive use permitting considerations. It's supposed to be the highest legislative priority for Agricultural Commissioner Pattison. It would establish some 20-year planning horizons for ag users statewide. It doesn't say anything about having to be consistent with local comprehensive plans. So we're concerned about that. There's a meeting with all the conservation groups on Monday with the Senate sponsor to try to go through some of those issues. There is a springs protection bill, House Bill 789, that would require the water management districts to identify all the magnitude 1 and 2 springs, and any that are in decline, which is basically all of them, would require a restoration plan that could be implemented. They don't say, by what means or how much money, so we'll be watching that. And the last water bill, House Bill 109, raised some eyebrows because it has an allowance for a 30-year consumptive use permit that can be extended for another 7 years, supposedly because the utilities want to be sure they have a bonding stream that covers an extended period. I think the concept is okay, but we're concerned about what sounds like water reservations that could be permanent. A couple of more budget-related items. We follow affordable housing issues. They had their trust fund swept for the last couple of years, just like the land buying programs. They'll be trying to protect $200 million that's projected to go into their programs this year. On the Florida Forever front, the governor's budget, which of course is advisory, has $75 million for land acquisition. $25 million is what we call real money. It's general revenue funds. The other $50 million would only come if the state sold surplus land for that amount. And then Donna mentioned this, we've got some petitions in the back. There is a constitutional ballot effort underway by a lot of the conservation groups, including the 1,000 Friends, to get signatures to put the constitutional provision in effect in 2014 that would set aside up to a third of all the dock stamps for tax deed filings, things of that sort, and exclusively restrict that for land acquisition, land protection program. We think that's important, especially given that the legislature has zeroed out those accounts for the last, basically for the last 3 years. Let me mention the Everglades. The governor does have $60 million in his proposed budget. That's a positive sign. Of course, the traditional figure has usually been about $100 million a year. And kind of related to that was a first fight in the legislature this week with sugar interests over some changes they're proposing to the Everglades Forever Act. What it would do essentially is, we say, minimize the contribution that Big Sugar would pay for Everglades cleanup and pass on the costs really to taxpayers. I'll come back. There's a big controversy over where the pollution is coming from going into the Everglades. Using the water management district's numbers, we're seeing that 60% of it is coming from the EAA, where the ag interests and sugar interests are located, but they, on a percentage basis, are probably paying about 10 to 12% of what that cost really should be. You'll be hearing a lot more about that. I think the count was, let's see, U.S. Sugar, or the sugar groups had about 27 to 29 lobbyists. Everglades Foundation that we work with brought about 14 lobbyists, and we lost 17-0 on the vote, which was even worse than the growth management fight the year before, but we'll be keeping at it. This is a new bill that was just filed last week, has all types of environmental permitting changes proposed in it. It limits local government requests for information on different kinds of permits, gives discounts for soft and submerged land leases, clarifies the role that water management districts have in issuing well permits, and it adds some of this information, or some of these other provisions that would insert the Department of Agriculture into the consumptive use permitting process. This was something that Donna asked me to update you on. If you haven't heard, the Department of Transportation has a major program underway called the Future Corridors Initiative, and they have big plans potentially for changing transportation in Florida. This actually came up in 2006, but Governor Christ put this on the back shelf because what it tends to do is, or it looks at new areas that don't have access, and would put public and private funds into those. There's a website here that you can get more information on. Thousand Friends has a website as well that will give you all the links to keep up to date on it. We cut that a little bit off. I'm going to tell you about the 3 programs they have that are their current priorities. Their first one is an area between Tampa and Jacksonville, and you can see that what you can't see on the map anyway. That corridor runs that far. It's probably a 50 to 100 mile wide corridor. The idea being that they're going to evaluate what kind of transportation, whether it's a road, light rail, or whatever else, might be appropriate to fit into one of these areas. On the face of it, that may not be a bad idea, but it certainly opens a lot of areas for concern. And I repeated my slide. This is the one that I want to make sure you are following, the Heartland Expressway. This is one that would go up, or begin somewhere in the Orlando I-4 corridor area, and then run down. There are 2 versions of it. This one shows a connection into southeast Florida all the way down to Miami-Dade. It swings by Lake Okeechobee, would open up hundreds of thousands of acres of land for development. It also has a West Coast component. It would sort of fork in South Florida and angle towards Charlotte County. And again, this is supposedly for economic development considerations, but you can see how the major environmental features that would be impacted by this. We're working with DOT and about 12 conservation groups to try to get some principles in place for how they would consider and evaluate these things. This Heartland Expressway, the one that I think is most relevant to you, actually is not one of their current priorities, but it bears watching for sure. I'm going to stop there. You can keep up with all of these issues that I've been talking about with these links. I think you'll have to do it on a regular basis. And we would certainly encourage you to speak out. We put little clips out from time to time. We have email alerts on different pieces of legislation if you'd like to be added. If you'll get me or Donna your email, we'll put you on the list. I think we've got some time for questions if there are any.
Sean, those roads that you brought up, they're going to be toll roads, right?
Well, they can't tell you what kind of road, if it's a road, or who's going to pay for it. But supposedly, it's a public or private toll road facility. That's what we keep hearing. But You know, we've seen that happen before where somebody builds a toll road, it doesn't pay for itself, and then the taxpayers end up having to bail somebody out. That's a big concern. Done.
Seems like one of the concerns I keep hearing is when you start opening those particular areas to development, that's a big recharge area for the water for the state, isn't it? Saltwater intrusion and everything?
Well, it's got some of the biggest, you know, natural systems left in the whole state in the interior. You're talking about 7.5 million acres really kind of, you know, through running anywhere along that Highland Expressway. And I think that's a real dilemma because, you know, the population numbers we show, while they're lower than what we had previously, we're still projecting another 14 million people in 50 years. That's, you know, Florida will pass New York in less than 2 years now. So, yeah. Maggie.
Charles, is somewhat similar to that, what you just answered. Is it the theory of DOT and the people sponsoring this that we don't have enough growth in Florida and we don't have enough room to grow and we need to open up some new areas?
Well, they couch it, and I think you know, when growth management got caught up in this 2 years ago, this is all about economic development. This is all about jobs. And
there aren't any ways to put jobs in the places that already exist?
well, that interesting. That was the point that Governor Chris made in saying, look, we're not going to spend public or private money in areas that don't have congestion issues now. We need to work where people, you know, have difficulties currently. This is a kind of build it and they will come approach.
So if we have a problem with having enough jobs in Martin County, they're going to put jobs in Highlands County to solve that?
Well, that's one way to look at it. Or Palm Beach County at the Inland Logistics Center, someplace like that. And of course, on top of everything else, we don't have a land acquisition program. And assuming you were going to do this, you would expect to see, you know, big public dollars going in to protect the most sensitive parts of these areas. And now, unless this constitutional amendment goes forward, we're looking at practically zero going for land acquisition these days.
Related to that, you don't have any wetland rules that are any place as good as Martin County's, right? In the other counties, like up at Ehaw Junction, when we drive across to see our daughter in Tampa on 60, I mean, there's miles and miles of beautiful wetlands.
Right. Well, you're right. Martin County is, you know, one of the leaders there. I think what we haven't seen, and I didn't mention the ones that we haven't seen, but we expect that they will come back, will be a preemption of local wetland ordinances. Somebody tries that every year in the legislature, and it's beaten back. It was last year, and it was the year before that. There'll probably be an effort to preempt local fertilizer ordinances. We see that every year too, so it's coming.
Well, somebody's covered the limit access, no access, or
Well, I said we were developing a set of principles. One of the things we think is critical is you've got to have extremely limited access if you have anything. And I think the big question we keep raising, and there doesn't seem to be any answer to it, these are meant to be 50-year projects. Is it really likely that in 50 years, roads are going to be what really is moving people and freight up and down Florida? Maybe something totally different. We worry about being stuck with these kind of things. In the back.
First of all, thank you for your efforts on our behalf. Even if what you've shown us has given us a great deal of heartburn. My question is, can you give us a brief explanation of the now lack of state oversight on local development and how the emphasis has shifted to the counties? Fortunately, we're in good hands here, but there's 66 other counties. And can you tell us also whether those counties are regulated as far as impact fees?
Well, let me start with the last and I'll work backwards. The impact fees are clearly authorized and allowed in Florida statutes, but you don't have to have them. And some communities that have had them have suspended them given the recession. We think that's a bad idea. Somebody's going to pay for those different impacts. And I think that even the responsible developers understand that they need to pay a fair share. There's always a debate about what that is. But impact fees or concurrency, you've got to protect yourself as a local government or your taxpayers are going to suffer. So we think that's a critical piece of any kind of plan. Your other question about what the state does or doesn't do, it's been substantially diminished from the time I was there. We had about 60 planners looking at plan amendments statewide, and there were various issues that the state could weigh in on. Today, they only have about 30 planners, many fewer. They have to make a particular finding that there's a state resource or facility that's being impacted by something the local government is trying to do. The problem is there's no definition for what that is. And as far as we know, there has not been, I think there's been one finding that the new agency, it's called DEO, Department of Economic Opportunity, raised. They supposedly resolved it, so there haven't been any legal challenges to test any of these provisions at this point. I think that's what we had said when they started this, that the only way you're going to get through it is by having litigation to define these terms, which is very costly and I think, ineffective, but that's what we've got. We've lost things like financial feasibility. Local governments can propose, or development interests can propose things that really cannot possibly be paid for, and now they can pass muster without having a state objection. There are probably a lot of other things that we could point to, but we think reestablishing a state oversight role is critically important.
And will there be any efforts this session to do that?
Not this session. I think we're realizing that until there's a better
Environment?
better environment, maybe a better administration or change in the legislature, we're not going to be able to break through on a lot of these issues.
Thank you.
Right.
Charles, I was able to sit in on one of your educational webinars recently, and I found it very helpful. Would you say a few words about that program and what you have coming up?
Thanks. I should have mentioned those. We do free webinars. You can check our website and find them. I think the next one actually is next week, the 13th. We're going to be going through some more, in a little more detail, some of these bills I mentioned, plus I've got some environmental bills that will be discussed in more detail. We would certainly welcome anyone that wants to do it. It's free. And we usually will post our notes, so if you miss it, you can go back and see the slideshows. We've done, we did one on conservation easements, I think a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure what else we've got. We've got one on coming up in April, dealing with sustainability factors that local governments might consider. So yeah, that's a program that actually gives professional planners credits to keep current in their profession, and we certainly welcome the public to those as well.
Charles?
Yes.
Touch on briefly on the flow program up there in North Florida.
Well, you're asking about a process. I think the mayor of High Springs was promoting the idea of having some major springs legislation. Unfortunately, fortunately to start with, Florida's got more magnitude 1 and 2 springs than any spot in the country, and I think internationally. They're all in bad shape because of phosphate or nitrate contamination. That comes from wastewater treatment or agricultural runoff or septic tanks. And several people are realizing that, and of course that's our drinking water source on top of everything else. There are efforts underway, but they unfortunately are mostly the minority party trying to do some legislation to protect the springs. I mentioned the one, just trying to get an inventory of the springs, and identification of which ones are in trouble seems to be problematic. There was a big fight last session that we had helped to get some legislation passed that would require septic tank inspections in order to make sure that they weren't adding to the pollution problem, and that got repealed. So it's a very touchy subject, but it's one of Florida's signature natural systems. Well, thank you, really appreciate it. I think Maggie's speaking next, and while she's coming up, I just wanted to say you cannot have a better resource than what Maggie provides you, and her work on chapters 1, 2, and 4, and I have more coming, is really a major help, and we're glad you're doing it, and glad we can help from time to time.